Hello, this is Colonial Puppet, and today we're going to be revisiting the Macintosh Plus series. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I don't blame you. The last episode of this series was posted a year ago, and there's only been 2 episodes in total. But basically, I bought a Macintosh Plus off of eBay, and it came with a keyboard, mouse, and external SCSI hard drive. And the last 2 episodes of this series has been a mix of troubleshooting the computer, as well as going over a brief history of the Macintosh Plus in general. So far, the only things that were found to be not working were the internal floppy drive and the keyboard that came with the computer. And while we were able to get the floppy drive working in episode 2, I had yet to work on the keyboard, which brings me to this episode. This episode was primarily supposed to be about getting the model M0110 keyboard that came with the Macintosh Plus working again. And I actually started filming this episode not too long after finishing episode 2, however I was unable to get the keyboard to work. And I honestly tried everything in my power to get that keyboard to work again, but I still wasn't able to figure out what was wrong with it. I tested the continuity of the key switches to see if it was just a contact issue. I tested each of the resistors on the PCB and all of them checked out fine. I even swapped out components with a donor board that I had, yet nothing I did actually fixed the keyboard, and to this day I still don't know what's wrong with it. However, you might also recall that in episode 2 I showed off a model M0110A keyboard that I also had, which is more appropriate to have with the Macintosh Plus anyway, as the M0110 normally came with the Macintosh 128 and Macintosh 512. And that M0110A keyboard does work, however it is missing a keycap and the key switch itself is broken and will need to be replaced. So in this video I'm going to be doing 3 things. I'm going to start with the keyboard, replacing the broken key switch and missing keycap, as well as cleaning and retro-brighting the keyboard itself. But aside from that, I'm also going to be cleaning and retro-brighting the entire Macintosh Plus computer, as well as recapping its analog board. So with that, let's get started on fixing up the keyboard. So unfortunately, the keyboard repair footage is about a year old, and I'm not sure what I was doing then because I didn't start filming until I had already disassembled the keyboard and applied the flux to the 2 traces that I'm going to remove the solder from. And these, of course, are the 2 traces going to the 1 broken key switch. I just use normal solder wick to suck up the solder and it comes right out. To replace this key switch, I just bought a new old stock one online, as well as the number 5 key cap that was missing as well. Thankfully, it was at this point that I decided to actually film the disassembly process for the M0110A keyboard, starting by just flipping it over on its face and removing the 6 screws underneath. And once those 6 screws are removed, it's as simple as removing the PCB and key assembly from the case itself. Next, I just pop in the key switch followed by the number 5 keycap. Then it's just a matter of flipping over the PCB and resoldering the 2 traces. At this point I thought that the keyboard was fully repaired, however when I tested it on the Macintosh Plus I found that some of the keys weren't working. I ended up removing all of the problem key switches and I tested each of them with my multimeter in continuity mode, and with this I found that none of these key switches were making a complete connection. To fix this, I first disassembled each of the problem key switches down to their individual parts. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on this metal part here. Essentially, I attempted to reinforce and exaggerate any bends or folds in this metal piece. Here you can see I'm using a pair of pliers to help rebend this fold here. Then I use my fingers to bend back this crease in the metal. Then lastly, I use the pair of pliers again to bend back these metal feet, being careful not to cut them off. To be honest, this is probably not the safest fix to these key switches, and it was thought up on the spot, but as you can see with the multimeter, it is now making a complete circuit and should work again. So after confirming that all of the adjusted key switches now work, the only thing left to do was to reassemble the keyboard. It was at this point that I decided to shelve this entire Macintosh Plus project, but after about a year I finally found the time to move on to the next step, which is to clean and RETR0BRIGHT the Macintosh Plus itself. So fast forward to 2020, I finally find the time to pick up where I left off with this Macintosh Plus restoration project. And the first thing I want to do is restore the Macintosh Plus cosmetically by tearing it down, cleaning the case, and also reversing some of the yellowing that occurred by RETR0BRIGHTing it. And as you can see, the case does need a good cleaning before any RETR0BRIGHTing can commence. So the first thing to do is to lay the computer down on its face and remove the 5 T15 Torx screws that are holding it together. And once the 5 screws are removed, I can now pop off the back case of the computer and discharge the CRT. And once the CRT is discharged, I can begin unplugging things and removing components. Here I'm removing the CRT screw that's holding down the ground wire. This is so I can remove the CRT Yolk connector cable. Next I'll remove these 3 screws holding the analog board to the frame, as well as this 4th grounding wire screw. And once this is done and everything's unplugged, I should be able to carefully remove the entire analog board from the computer. Then I remove the 3 remaining screws holding down the CRT to remove it from the front face. And then I slide the entire logic board and RF shield out from the frame like so. Now this next part I really didn't have to do since I wasn't going to work directly on the floppy drive, but for some reason I decided to remove the floppy drive sled by removing these 4 screws, after which the sled just slides right out. Then there is a total of 5 T15 Torx screws that are holding the frame of the computer to the front face that need to be removed. After which the frame can be pulled away from the front face, and now I can begin cleaning each of the 2 plastic case pieces. Starting with the front face of the computer, the first cleaning solution I use is just plain old Windex. It does a good job of removing just surface dirt and grime, and overall it's good at isolating the areas that are going to need further attention with other cleaning solutions like alcohol. Speaking of which, the next solution I use is IPA, which gets rid of the more stubborn areas. I also break out a toothbrush to get the harder to reach areas such as these vent holes and the opening for the floppy drive. Now I think this computer had one of those polarizing filters affixed to the front over top the CRT, because there's these weird strips of dried up adhesive around the perimeter of where the CRT is. And to remove this adhesive I had to use a combination of Goo Gone, WD-40, and mechanical removal with a flathead screwdriver like so. It put up a good fight, but I was eventually able to remove all of the adhesive without damaging any of the plastic. Well, actually that's a lie. I did manage to remove all of the adhesive and I didn't damage any of the case plastic, but that wasn't until I used my next method of cleaning, which is baking soda and water. And using baking soda is a method that I don't want to use unless I absolutely have to, because it is a mild abrasive and is actually actually removing a small layer of plastic. And so if you use baking soda too liberally, you will remove any texture that the plastic may have had, and I found that even if you use baking soda sparingly, sometimes the area you use it in will appear unevenly polished in certain light conditions compared to the rest of the case. It's also very easy to accidentally remove any silk screening on a case, even if you're not treating that area of the case directly. But anyway, after touching up the front face with some baking soda and then giving it a rinse in the sink, I placed it in a RETR0BRIGHT solution of hydrogen peroxide and let it sit in the sun for a couple of hours. And while the front face was soaking in the solution, I decided to turn my attention to cleaning the back case of the computer. And this essentially involved the same process we used for cleaning the front face of the computer, starting with a Windex clean followed by IPA, and then touching up any areas that still weren't affected with some baking soda and water. A few hours later, after the front face was finished soaking in the RETR0BRIGHT solution, I decided to compare it with the back case of the computer, and as you can see, the RETR0BRIGHT made a significant difference in the color of the front face compared to the back. So naturally, my next step was to place the back case into a RETR0BRIGHT solution, and while that sat in the sun, I started the process of reassembling the computer. Now fast forward a couple days and I actually had to undo a lot of what you just saw in order to remove the analog board because this showed up in the mail. And what this is an analog board recap kit from console5.com, which essentially replaces all of the major capacitors on the analog board. And while this particular Macintosh Plus didn't really seem to have any issues with the CRT or the image quality, I decided to replace the caps anyway because they are eventually going to go bad. And I'm not going to show myself doing much of this repair, partly because there are already so many videos of it on YouTube, and also because most of the footage was me fidgeting with my new soldering station and trying to get it to work properly. But anyway, after recapping the analog board and after cleaning the hydrogen peroxide off of the back case and letting it dry for a bit, it was time to reassemble the computer and see how it all turned out. Alright, so here is the Macintosh Plus before the cleaning and RETR0BRIGHT. And here it is after. To be honest, it really wasn't that bad to begin with, minus maybe the slight yellowing and the dried adhesive around the CRT area, but now it looks almost brand new. It's virtually spotless, and overall I'm very happy with how it turned out. And while I didn't show any process work, I also cleaned and RETR0BRIGHTed the mouse and the keyboard along with the faceplate of the external SCSI hard drive. And as you can see, this thing probably looks just as good as it did in the late 80s and early 90s. But anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for this episode of the Macintosh Plus exploration and restoration. It's still not perfect. I still need to remove some corrosion in the battery terminal on the analog board, and I do want to eventually find a replacement battery for it. And on top of that, I also want to make some adjustments to the CRT picture. But as of right now, I'm quite happy at how this project turned out. And with that, this has been Colonial Puppet. Have a nice day.